Now I know what you're thinking. This has to be one of the most pretentious things I've ever read in a YouTube title. How the f do these YouTubers keep finding new ways to praise a game that's been as worshipped and critically acclaimed as Red Dead Redemption 2? Look, I can't pretend to be some kind of profound poet who can manipulate a gargle of words and make it all sound like a bunch of enlightened wisdom. In reality, the YouTubers who can do that are like modern day witch doctors who just dangle fish bones in front of your face as they hoodwink you into believing their magic. As much as making magniloquent video essays is a real treat to my creative ego, the intention of this video isn't to blow a bunch of smoke up your ass and leave you feeling as if I taught you something esoteric in nature. This video is more or less something that I've been trying to approach for years, and I am now finally putting words to paper, or in your case, audio to your headphones. Red Dead Redemption 2 didn't exactly produce a come to Jesus moment per se, nor did a certain action or plot in the story transform my life on the spot. It was more like a culmination of multiple realizations just gradually sank in one late night while I was playing Red Dead Redemption 2 in my barracks room. I remember I was deep into a collectibles quest when I came upon a random event. A man was limping towards the road on the verge of death while he pleaded for help. He had eaten a poisonous plant and was now facing life or death. Now, this isn't anything out of the ordinary in Red Dead Redemption because random events like this happen all the time. Basically, you are given a choice as to how you want to approach or act upon a situation, which will then affect your honor score. Let's take the man dying from eating a poisonous plant as an example. You have the option to give him medicine or perhaps take him into town to get help. These can be seen as honorable choices, and therefore your honor bar at the bottom of the screen will push in the direction of the right, meaning honorable or good for simple terms. But let's just say that instead of helping this man, you were to antagonize him and watch him die in front of you, and then maybe even after his passing you were to loot his now deceased corpse. These are seen as dishonorable actions and thus brings the scale to the left, meaning bad or dishonorable. Now, I don't mean to insult your intelligence if you've played the game, because the system has been around since the first Red Dead Redemption. But for the first time, I really thought about how this stupid little bar and honor system made me compulsively want to do the honorable thing at any given moment. I could have been on my way to donate a fresh animal pelt for my camp, but if a woman with the fallen horse on top of her would have appeared, I would have felt instantly compelled to ditch that pelt off of my horse in order to make room for her. Had any person needed my help throughout my entire playthrough, I can guarantee there would have been a 97% probability that your boy, the Hawk Diesel, would have been trying to play that Wild Western hero. The honor system played a large role in the grand scheme of the story itself because it acted as a morality system that gauged Arthur Morgan's actions. You were free to play Arthur how you wanted to, but the game changed depending on what choices you were making in the story as well as the open world. Some changes in the game based upon your honor included how characters would treat or speak about you. Certain missions would play out with vastly different tones and elements to reflect your morality, as well as Arthur's personality as a whole. But most importantly, the kind of ending you received as a result of your honor is what really solidified what kind of story you made for Arthur Morgan. While there were multiple ways that you could have played Arthur Morgan in the end, it was up to you to either play him as a bad man with the inability to escape the path that he had led, or you played him to be a man who realized the error of his ways had cost him his own mortality, and at the revelation of this decided to try and do some good in the end. As I'm sure you figured out by now, I played Arthur Morgan to be an honorable man. Therefore, I got the high honor ending, which made his death play out in an almost beautiful manner despite how the story ends for him. Especially once you've seen the low honor ending, which really opens your eyes as to how striking the contrast could have been in your playthrough. I'm not really here to get into a debate of what path people took on their initial run-through or what their decisions say about them as a person, because frankly that's a case study in its own right and not really the point of this video. You see, what got me about the honor system that night in particular was that I finally took a step back and reassessed the game as a whole. Here I was about to save this man without a doubt in my mind that this is what I had to do in this wild western open world, taking place a couple years after the Civil War and 1 year before the year 1900. By all accounts, it's right on par with the name in itself. The Wild West expression to me has always meant a place of lawlessness in the attempt to establish some kind of civility and order amidst the chaos of Western expansion. When I would ride around the beautiful world of Red Dead Redemption, I felt life poured into the open country, as well as feeling the rush of living out this outlaw fantasy. Your gang takes what they want and live by their own rules, not tied down or restrained by any establishment, but you also get to feel the consequences of living the way of the outlaw, whether it be through the greater and bigger forces of the government or perhaps from a greater power. You get the sense that this outlaw's dream idea of freedom is on a timer. As the era of the American frontier is coming to an end, outlaws are being hunted and are no longer tolerated for living their lawless ways. Law and order is finally converting the Wild West into just the plain old West. The Wild West expression is used pretty often in my vocabulary. My dad used to refer to the small town I grew up in as the Wild West due to it being filled with people who did what they wanted with little to no repercussions. A bit of an exaggeration, but he wasn't necessarily wrong either. For as long as I can remember, and from understanding pop culture over the years, we've always romanticized the American Wild West, at least here in the USA. Western movies, movies, TV shows, books, video games all have contributed to the history of the genre in itself. Now, when I say romanticized, I mean that in various instances, the Wild West is simplified and portrayed in a manner that's as black and white as the photographs from that era, leaving a lot of gray area out on the editing room floor. It felt like there were only heroes and villains, do-gooders and evildoers, lawmen and criminals. In my opinion, the Western movie genre is what superhero movies are today. They were this huge blockbuster spectacle and were iconic in their own right. I have fond memories of going to Hollywood Video with my dad where I'd get Batman the Animated Series on VHS or the newest Batman movie, and my dad would pick up his old Western movies. Whenever I would finish my tapes, I would sit down and watch them with him, enthralled with the old cool guys that were cowboy heroes. I always thought that's just how the Old West kind of worked. Even into my adult age, I just figured there were only good guys and bad guys in that time period. Thus, in my playthrough of Red Dead Redemption, I just figured I was supposed to be the good guy, never questioning if it was anything other than just good or bad. I was clinging on to the strange notion that the past was pretty black and white, and the times we live in now are far more complicated and conflicting. That's exactly where my naivety stopped, though. Here I was assuming that the people of today have more problems than the people of old did. I figured the evil in the world today was something completely different in its entirety, and borderline hopeless to fix. Which is fucking dumb to think about, because if you know your history, you'd know just how brutal the Wild West was. Manifest destiny, rugged individualism, or frontier thesis aside, don't let any of these themes fool you into believing that those times weren't built on the backs of savages and opportunists. The road to hell has always been paved with good intentions, and it burdened me to think of how people must have either had a loss in their faith or had faith so strong that they pushed on regardless of their circumstances. Now, of course, I'm not here to tell you that the Wild West was something out of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, but my epiphany, or conundrum if you will, was more or less coming to terms that maybe the evils and problems of today aren't necessarily different than what the folks back in the day had gone through. If we take the game Red Dead Redemption 2 as an example, I think part of what makes the game as amazing as it is has to do with how relatable the elements of the story are, as well as the familiarity you feel while playing.
But any livestock, you're gonna need a barn.
Barn will take 3 of us 6 months to build.
Oh, you don't build a barn, dumbass! What do you think this is, 1785?
I don't think at any moment I ever disassociated with the game due to it feeling unbelievable or non-genuine in its interpersonal problems and relationships. As a character-driven narrative, it's not entirely far-fetched to buy into what these characters were dealing with, whether it be their behaviors or their relationship dynamics with one another. Many themes that are presented in the game are still a common theme you'd see today by all accounts. Greed, family, revenge, or the inability to run from change. Yes, I know it's a video game, and I obviously don't relate to any of the gunfighting, the heists, the Rockstar open-world elements, or the aspects of being an outlaw, but that's what makes a video game such a unique medium for storytelling and entertainment. As ubiquitous as video games are, they are still slept on in the eyes of modern masses and critics. Sure, lately they picked up more steam and people are coming around, but they still don't fully appreciate the scope of what a video game can provide or make you feel versus any traditional media. Which reminds me, one of my favorite movies of all time, No Country for Old Men, happens to relate to the theme of what I was talking about earlier. I want to play a scene that really changed my perspective on feeling like I was the only one dealing with something, or that my problems were somehow different or worse than what anyone else had ever experienced. This scene, for context, comes after the sheriff in the story, who's also one of the main characters, decides to retire after feeling overmatched by the violence that carries on throughout the movie. This violence includes a bunch of drug-related murders, an unstoppable psychopathic hitman, and his failure to save the protagonist from these forces. He perceives all of this violence as new evil, and therefore takes the full burden of blame because he alone wasn't able to stop it. He has this hidden messiah complex that somehow it was solely up to him to stop all the evil he was experiencing, and because he himself couldn't stop it, he instead gave up and retired. He was assuming that he could never get the world to change back into the good old days as he believed it, where these problems apparently didn't exist. Soon after retiring, he visits with his cousin Ellis, where the scene plays out.
Loretta tells me you're quitting. How come you're doing that?
I don't know. I feel overmatched. I always figured when I got older, God would sort of come into my life somehow. He didn't. I don't blame him. If I was him, I'd have the same opinion of me that he does.
You don't know what he thinks. Did Daddy ever tell you how Uncle Mac come to his reward? Gunned down on his own porch over in Hudspeth County. 7 or 8 of them come up there. Wanting this, wanting that. Uncle Mac went back in the house to get the shotgun. Well, there's ahead of him. Shot him in his doorway. Aunt Ella come out and tried to stop the bleeding. Uncle Mac all the while trying to get that shotgun. They just sat there on their horses, watching him die. After a while, one of them said something in Indian, and they turned and left out. Uncle Mac knew the score, even if Aunt Ella didn't. Shot through the left lung. And that was that, as they say. She buried him the next morning, digging in that hard old caliche. What you got ain't nothing new. This country's hard on people. You can't stop what's coming. It ain't all waiting on you. That's vanity.
No Country for Old Men helped me come to grips with the discernment that my problems don't make me special or distinct from anybody else. Keep in mind, this whole enigma of mine started when I was 21, so cut me a little slack as to discovering the power of empathy and selflessness so late. That scene is powerful because here's the sheriff who idolized the lawmen of the past, often comparing himself to a lesser degree than them and always assuming that those were the good times and that what he's dealing with now had to be different than what anyone else had ever dealt with. Here he was assuming that only one man was supposed to take on all the evil in the world, and because that man couldn't do it, aka him, he was going to give up the badge for good. Ellis told him this story about their uncle, who was also a lawman, to prove to him that what he's currently going through isn't anything new. This country has always been hard on people, and the brutality and cruelty of man has spanned since the beginning of time. You can't stop or run from the tragedies and darkness in life itself. It's coming at you whether you're ready or not. Evil will always adapt with the times, which means you have to be steady. Ellis is basically telling the sheriff that if he thinks the world is a cruel and unforgiving place just because the sheriff failed or the sheriff didn't try hard enough, and simply accepted that the times he's living in now is the worst there's ever been in the world, and that times were simpler before him, then that is vanity. Now, for the uninitiated, I may have just pulled a fast one on you because where does the change my perception on morality in my title come into play? I could have easily told you that I started seeing the world for what it was, and I am thankful for the role models in my life that have shown me how to be a good man amidst all the bad in the world. But that's kind of pretentious. I'm not a superhero or a righteous warrior trying to justify my actions by stroking my ego of how I've been put here to fight evil all on my own. First of all, it's corny and cringy to think in that manner. Second of all, I don't have a messiah complex like the sheriff in the movie had. But most importantly, that's not what solves my dilemma or the problem the sheriff was facing. So, big deal. The world has always been a dark and brutal place. What does that mean for me now, though? I've never been a man of faith, so putting my belief in something felt just like that honor system in Red Dead Redemption. I wasn't sure why I tried to do things honorably in the game, and I can say the same thing about my life. All I can say is that I've tried to be decent, but not without the bad I've also done unto others. Given there's no honor bar over my head telling me what's right from wrong, but one could argue that you are your own moral compass for gauging your own morality. Well, I'd hope so anyways. What finally helped me bring this to an end actually comes from the same movie, which also ties into the theme of a book called The Road, written by the same author. No Country for Old Men, the movie, was made by the Coen brothers, but the book was written by a man named Cormac McCarthy, an author famous for books such as No Country for Old Men, Blood Meridian, which I mentioned earlier, and most famously, The Road. Before I show you the specific scene, I'd like to shout out Wendigoon.
I don't know how much I can put my faith in a man named Cornbread, but I wasn't going to not mention that.
He made a No Country for Old Men video that legitimately helped me discover a theme within the books and movie that ended up changing my life because of it, and overall flipped these works of art on their head for me. Link to that video below. This scene comes at the very end of the movie as our man, the sheriff, is telling his wife that he had a dream about his father. For context, his father was also a sheriff at one point, and both even served at the same time for a bit. The sheriff clearly still looks up to his father and idolizes him despite being older than his father ever was. Anyways, here's the scene.
It was like we was both back in the older times. And I was a horseback, going through the mountains of the night, going through this pass in the mountains. It was cold, and there was snow on the ground. He rode past me and kept on going, never said nothing going by, just rode on past. And he had his blanket wrapped around him and his head down. When he rode past, I seen he was carrying fire in a horn, the way people used to do, and I could see the horn from the light inside of it, about the color of the moon. And in the dream, I knew that he was going on ahead. And he's fixing to make a fire somewhere out there in all that dark and all that cold. And I knew that whenever I got there, he'd be there. And then I woke up.
If you were left feeling confused by this scene, don't worry. Many people were confused as well, but to explain it the best way I can, I'll break it down in a literal sense and a metaphorical sense, because they are detrimental to understanding the scene properly. To explain the literal sense of what he's talking about, back in the old days, they'd use buffalo horns to carry embers of a previous fire so that they could easily go and kindle a new fire wherever they planned to make their new camp. So in his dream, he speaks of his father riding on past him to make a fire in all that darkness up ahead. He knew that when he caught up, his father would be there waiting for him. Now, in the metaphorical sense, this dream is taking place out in the cold and darkness of the night, which is a reference to the overwhelming evils of the world. His father rides on ahead, passing him while carrying what is essentially fire in a horn, intending to make a fire in spite of all that cold and darkness. This is a reference to his father carrying the fire. One man cannot illuminate the darkness away all on his own, but one man can carry on the fire of good despite the crippling pressure of the darkness at large. To think you can fix it all on your own is a fool's dream, but to be able to remain steady regardless of knowing it won't change the world is what we need. His father is essentially showing him that his job is to carry the fire forward so that the next man may do the same and continue passing the torch. Good will not necessarily prevail, but it has to be there to show others that it is possible and necessary to pass on. The sheriff knows that when he gets to where his father is going, that torch will be there for him to help guide him in all of that darkness as well, meaning he will also carry the fire. Now, to tie in the theme of carrying the fire, I want to do it justice by playing a clip of Wendigoon talking about the connecting themes between The Road and No Country for Old Men.
Cormac McCarthy is my favorite author, and he has this trick that he does throughout his books where the themes or solutions of one film is picked up with as the meaning behind another. What I mean by that is things mentioned at the end of one story that sort of wrap the bow on the symbolism that has been building up throughout is then used as a narrative or the structure for the next story he tells. It's as if all of his collections are symbolic sequels and prequels of each other. So following that logic, this movie is the predecessor to The Road. The Road, which is my favorite novel of all time, follows the story of a father and son going through a post-apocalypse. The theme of struggle against the world is brought up several times through that story as well. However, every time that the son asks his father if what they're doing is worth it, the father tells the son that we are carrying the fire. What he means by this is that in such a dark and desolate world, there needs to be those who carry the torch now more than ever. Especially in the story The Road, it seems like it'd be a great idea to just give up and call it quits as the sheriff did in No Country for Old Men. But then, who would carry the torch?
Being completely honest, that theme changed my life when I discovered what it was and what it meant. I remember ranting about it to my coworkers out of the blue because I was so caught up in that theme. I think some of you actually may have been forced to read The Road in high school, but if you were like me, I had never read it before. When I finished the book, it stuck with me for a long time. I remember a sense of relief washed over me due to finding something I could actually identify with. That theme helped me realize that being decent in a world that feels like it doesn't deserve it at times is still needed despite how you may review the reality of it. I couldn't promise or swear that I'd be a good man because of it, but at the very least I could try to be one in spite of how I may have been living my life. Red Dead Redemption 2 and No Country for Old Men may not look like they could be comparable to one another, but upon watching and playing the game again, I realized there were too many themes and similarities between the two that I finally just made the plunge to try and connect the two after recently finishing the story again. Now that I've seen it with fresh eyes, I believe I solidified why the theme of carrying the fire holds so much weight for me. Arthur Morgan's sacrifice coincided a lot with this ongoing theme. He spent so much time trying to run from change and ignoring the truth of what his blind loyalty had caused in all those years of running with the gang that, after his brush with mortality in the form of tuberculosis, he was forced to self-reflect and begin seeing the world for what it truly was. Unlike the sheriff who submitted to the problems at large in the world, he realized that through his own actions, his own lack of empathy, and his own lack of compassion, he had left a trail of victims throughout his life. Yet instead of cowering down and allowing it to define him like someone with a victim mentality, he was instead going to try and do some good before he met his own demise, through the path of redemption. He didn't believe he could ever be capable of being a good man, but at least he could help someone who could use his guidance, his protection, and most importantly, his compassion. Despite finally seeing things clearly, he knew he wouldn't be able to change the situation as a whole. Nevertheless, he still drew his line in the sand and faced it head on. Arthur Morgan said he wasn't seeking salvation as a dying man because he believed it was too late for that. And although he may not have been a good man throughout his entire life, his actions and sacrifices in his last few days on Earth are what ultimately defined him. He allowed himself to finally act as the man he didn't know he could be, a man capable of doing actual good. It was what he chose to do after discovering the kind of man he had been that said the most about his character. It might be the hidden optimist in me, but I always remember Arthur for who he became after he found out about his illness, a man conflicted with his own morality that found a way to seek and find redemption in his final days. It's honorable and admirable, to be quite honest. For a man who lived his life the way that he did and still managed to display a capacity for change, it allowed me to realize our potential for change and growth. You may not be able to undo your past mistakes, but you do have the ability to evolve from them. Unbeknownst to Arthur, his final act acted as a passing of the torch to John Marston. This final act allowed John to see what the actions of what one good man did for him and his family, like a torch or guiding light amidst all the darkness around him. To me, Arthur Morgan was carrying the fire all along. Despite being a man who lived his life with the sorrowful blind eye to the consequences of his actions, he still decided to not allow his past to find him in his wake, but rather allow himself to be selfless and carry the fire forward so that others may do the same. He may not have known that's what others would take from his sacrifice, but in his final moments he had finally managed to prove to himself he was truly capable of being good. Therefore, to me, he will always be one of the greatest characters ever written.
You lost.
In the end, Michael, despite my best efforts to the contrary, it turns out I've won.
This video is not my traditional video essay, but it's a video I've been wanting to make for a while now. Think of it as a video made for me that I'm sharing with you. I'm not sure if I'm done with Red Dead Redemption videos as a whole, but if I were to make another one, it'd be about John Marston and probably the theme of a man on borrowed time. Look, by no means did I cover No Country for Old Men and Red Dead Redemption 2 as a whole, but I'm sure there will be plenty of comments telling me that I missed the best part or that I didn't talk about their favorite part. Like I said, it's a video for me. I basically spoke about what I took away from the two as a connecting theme, and I never once said that's what they should be solely interpreted or perceived as. If you want to break down, there's plenty of that out there. Anyways, big thanks to Wendigoon again, and all the support from you guys. Catch you in the next one. Thanks.
I don't make no moves unless my heart is in it. Everything had changed when my mind started shifting. It's always up to you and that's from start to finish. They don't want to see you win cause that's just hard to witness.